Hey everybody, how are you doing today? So early in December, I decided that I wanted to read the top 10 fantasy nomination in the Goodreads Choice Awards for 2019. And fantasy books are typically pretty big books, so it took me in the entire month of December to read them. I ended up reading 11 books in the fantasy category, 9 in the top 10, and 2 outside of the top 10 that are further down in the top 20. Amazingly, out of all of those books that I read, there was only one that I didn't like and one that I skipped on in reading in the top 10, which we'll cover once we get to that point. Now you might wonder why I decided to read these books. And there's a couple of reasons. First, I just love fantasy books, so any chance to read other people's favorites in fantasy for the year, I want to jump on because there's a very good likelihood that I'm going to find a new favorite myself. Second, I kind of wanted to know what's supposed to be in this category and what's just miscategorized or voted on simply because of the author, even if the book wasn't very good. Now, we all know that the Goodreads Choice Awards at this point are just a popularity contest. The winner of every single category has far more votes than people who actually read the book, and if you think of it in a statistical way, then the highest rated book in each category should be the number one in each category, but often you'll find out the highest rated book just isn't ranked highly because just not that many people have read it. Also, the Goodreads Choice Award categorizes its books based on what the user has shelved it as and not on what the publisher or author has designated that type of book as. So often books will be in completely the wrong category. For example, if Stephen King happens to write a fantasy novel, that novel is far more likely to show up in the horror category just because everybody automatically associates Stephen King with horror novels. This happens all across the board, and a lot of it is open to interpretation. For the fantasy category, there were 4 books that I feel were miscategorized, and I'll kind of explain what categories I think they should have belonged to once we get to them in this video. Now, I'm going to go through each one of these books in the order that Goodreads rank them, and then I will give my personal rankings as I talk about the books, and at the very end of the video, I'll throw up a graphic that shows my ratings versus Goodreads ratings. We're gonna start with number 17, which is Brent Weeks' The Burning White. This is the 5th book in the series, so it's going to be really hard to give a synopsis of just this book because it'll just spoil all of the other books. So I am going to use what Brent Weeks said as a recap of just the series overall. He's actually really, really good in his big, thick books like this, where he does recaps, and it goes through book by book and everything like that. So I am going to paraphrase what he wrote because he's way better at explaining his own books than I am. So these books take place in the Empire of the Seven Strappies, and in this empire, some people are born with the ability to create luxin, which is a physical substance, out of light. And the luxin comes in 9 separate colors, and it is created through a process known as drafting. Now, each color drafted has different physical and metaphysical abilities, and have more uses than could possibly be named. So these drafters are traditionally trained in the Empire's capital known as the Chromaria, and depending on the drafter's ability, number of colors they can draft, and usefulness of those colors, they tend to live a fairly privileged, cushy life. In exchange for this cushy life and powerful ability, like many magic systems, there is a consequence to using magic. So as you use more and more of your magic, your irises of your eye will fill up with the color that you're using, and once it reaches the outer rim of your eye or outer rim of your iris, then it breaks the halo and you go crazy. So in order to combat powerful, crazy magic users all over the land, the religious leader of this society, known as the Prism, is tasked with every year on a holiday called Sunday of freeing the drafters that are about to break their halo. Now, freeing means basically what you think it is, and he ceremoniously kills them. So obviously there are some drafters who will break their halo accidentally or purposefully and not wish to join the freeing, because, I mean, who really wants to volunteer to die? And these people run away, and once they break their halo, they're known as rights or color rights. And they are hunted down and killed by either other drafters or powerful members of like a guard society known as the Black Guard, which take a very important role in this story. So the only person in this society that can just freely draft as many colors and as much power as they want to is the Prism, who is, as I said earlier, the religious leader. And the Prism, male or female, their main job as a religious leader is not to free the drafters, but it's to create a balance in the colors across the world. So if somebody, or if there's too much of one particular color being drawn or used, then it creates chaos. Everything in this universe with the colors need balance. So the Prism's job is basically to make sure that all the colors are being balanced by drafting colors in opposite, like a color wheel, to balance everything out on a daily basis. Now, the Prism seems all powerful, but there is a limit to their rule, and every 7 years or multiples of 7 years, so 7, 14, etc., 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 the Prism can start to fail as a Prism, and their eyes will start to fill up with colors. And in this religious world, for some reason, this always happens at a 7-year mark. Now, at the end of the 7 years, the Prism will die, whether it's voluntarily or they're also being hunted down. And they are, or another Prism is elected by the rulers. They're called the colors. There's one color represented for, or one color, as in a person known as a color, represented for each of the 7 major colors. Kind of confusing, but as you might be able to tell, it's a pretty interesting magic system. Now, I fell in love with these books years and years and years ago when they first came out, and I've kind of been reading the series as it went along. Earlier this year, I did a reread of the series and finished this book in November, so well before the Goodreads Choice Awards nominations ever even came out. But because it was in the top 20, I kind of want to talk about it and give you my take on what I thought of this particular fantasy book. Without spoiling anything, it was fantastic. Magic system's great. I love the characters. I can kind of empathize with the characters. A lot of stories like this, the major thing is like there's a character that you root for or you see yourself in. And if you don't like any characters, it's very, very hard to like a book like this even if the magic system is really good. And there's multiple characters that I like, and there's multiple characters that I love to hate. Overall, I ranked this number 3 on my list, but I do understand that a lot of people will have not read this book because it's the 5th in a series, and all of the books in the series are like this thick, so it's a little bit of a chunker. Good news is, if you guys are interested in starting a new big epic fantasy series, this was the final book in the series, so this is a complete series. You could start at book number 1 and get through the entire series without having to wait years for the author to create another book. The next book on this list is number 11. It is The 10,000 Doors of January by Alex Harrow. This one I just happened to have from the Book of the Month Club, so I decided after finishing all of the other books in the series to read it. So the synopsis goes on about her finding a book that introduces her to the world of these doors. It's a little bit misleading because the book that she finds is not really hugely relevant to the story. This type of story is like the story within a story that I typically really like to read about, where it's kind of fairy tale-esque. There's no real like timeline, like people go in and out of time because there's a story within a story that tells another story that all is going to tie itself together at the very end of the book. Honestly, this book is so forgettable. Out of everything on this list, this is the most recent one that I've read, and I can barely remember what happened in this story already. So I don't feel like it's bad, and I don't feel like I had any major problems with it. I just don't remember it, and it's going to be ranked really lowly on my list because I just don't remember what's going on. It didn't have a story that stuck with me. This is also the first book that we're coming across in this list that I believe is ranked incorrectly. I did mention that I got this in the Book of the Month Club, which you can kind of see by this little symbol right here, but I subscribe to the Young Adult Book of the Month Club, so this should be in the Young Adult Fantasy section, and it does follow a young girl. She starts out in her like 7, 8 years old and goes up into her early teens by the end of this book, but it's really targeted towards young adults. It's also a much thinner book than a lot of the ones you're going to see in the fantasy section here today. So yeah, forgettable book, miscategorized. I'm putting this at number 10 out of 11 books on my list. Next on this list at number 10 is Middlegame, which I read as an ebook, so I don't have a physical copy, so I'm going to stick it up over here for you to see the cover. Now, this is, to me, a science fiction book, and you'll kind of be able to tell why in the description. So, the two main characters of this book are twins, Roger and Dodger, and Roger is a twin skilled with words and language, and Dodger is the twin skilled in math. Now, Roger is a male, Dodger is a female. Dodger is kind of one of those names that you can't really tell if it was supposed to be feminine or masculine going into this. But they're genetically engineered twins. They were not born how people are normally born. They were created in a laboratory and then kind of put out in the world to be raised in a seemingly normal fashion so they could be the best, most socialized people they can be, instead of being raised in the lab where they're not really socialized and don't really understand humanity, because without understanding humanity, they can't reach their destiny. They're godlike, but not exactly gods, even though it's implied that they have the ability to become gods. Or the thing about this book is it's presented a lot as a Groundhog Day type of story where the day can be repeated multiple times over and over and over again, which that is just a trope that I absolutely hate. This is the one book on the list because of like the science fiction and that trope that I was just like, I don't want to read this at all. I did read it, and it's a pretty decent book. The whole Groundhog Day thing doesn't really actually happen. You get mentioned that the day's been repeated, but you don't see it happening over and over and over again. So that ends up making this book a lot more enjoyable for me than I thought it was going to be. But overall, it just wasn't really my thing. I think this is a very character-driven narrative because you're just constantly focusing on Roger and Dodger, and I didn't like Roger or Dodger. I thought they were both like flawed in ways that made them uninteresting to me personally. And with this being a character-driven narrative and not liking the characters, I enjoyed it as a story, but it's not something that I want to revisit or that is going to be an all-time favorite going forward. If this sounds like something interesting to you, then I know Books and Lala like had this as her #1 book of the year, so maybe you'll like it. It is a really interesting story and some really interesting science fiction concepts. It just wasn't a great book for me particularly. And like I mentioned earlier, this book is miscategorized with the alchemy and genetic creation and stuff like that. Like, this is very much science fiction. It's just like I see the fantasy in it because they use the scientific fantasy or scientific fiction. Imagine where the word came from. But they use the scientific fiction to create like a fantasy-like landscape, but there is nothing magical about their magical abilities. It is all based in potential science. So, second book on this list that's miscategorized, but I still understand why people would put it in this category to begin with. Overall, I rank this #8. And like I said, there's only one book that I didn't like, so 8 doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it wasn't my favorite on this list of really, really, really good books. Next book on this list is Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James. Now, I also do not have this book. I listened to this as an audiobook, and after reading some of the reviews on this, I think the way to go with this book is an audiobook. Apparently, the writing is just very wordy and elaborate and like descriptive, and it's like almost poetry-like and much harder to read, but it's very easy to like listen to and become absorbed in this world. Now, this is the first book in a trilogy, and the premise of this book is a man named Tracker, who is the main character of this story, has been paid to track a missing child. His magical ability, because it's fantasy, so of course there's got to be magical ability, is his nose. He's known for his nose, which means he can smell where somebody's been or where somebody's going. This is really hard to describe, actually. So if he's met somebody or has their scent, he can find them no matter where they are in the world. Physically, there is no way he can be able to smell somebody who is 3 weeks travel away. He can just smell something and metaphysically know the direction that person's in, and then as he gets closer to that person, he can find that person by their smell. It's a really, really cool concept, and it leads to really cool descriptions that you don't typically hear of in fantasy novels, because normally the author is going to be describing what you see more than anything. Occasionally you'll get mention of like what you hear in a forest or things like that, but with Tracker's ability, one of the main description points is the smells of everything around you, and it just kind of puts you inside of the world so much more than you would typically be in a novel. Now, a lot of the smells are pretty freaking disgusting, but to me that made it a cooler book. There is a band of misfits basically that get together to track down this child, all with different magical abilities, and then Tracker is the character that you're hearing this story from, because at the start of the story you realize that Tracker has been arrested for murdering a child, and he is telling his story to a police type man who is interrogating him about what happened. And Tracker kind of gives his entire life story leading up to this incident that he has been arrested for. And I think that's another reason why this book is really good in audio, because you're hearing, like, the story is meant to be told out loud to the interrogator, and then you're actually hearing it told out loud. So take that as you will. Now, I really, really like this book, but I know it's not for everyone. I want to go over a couple of things that I liked about it, and then a couple of the problematic things about this book. Why is problematic a hard word to say today? Anyway, this is the first book that I personally have ever read where the main character is a homosexual man, and his sexuality has absolutely no relevance to the plot at all. He could easily have been a straight man and the exact same story would have been told. This is fantastic because while a lot of new books are coming out with representation for LGBTQ, most of them are based, like, the plot of the story is based around the character's sexuality, while we've had novels for years and years and years where the main characters can have a sexuality, typically straight, and it's known that it exists, but it's not any part of the story whatsoever. And this is, as I said, the first book that I personally read where the character is a strong, manly character who is just unabashedly gay, and he likes men, and he talks about in gross detail sex, but it doesn't have anything at all to do with the story, and that is fantastic. Now, with that said, this story in no way is good representation. Like, there are a lot of triggers, is probably the best description for this, just throughout this story. There is sexual assault described in vivid detail. There is pedophilia, there is children being murdered, there is bestiality described in gross detail, and the book is really dark and raw and overly descriptive on very, very traumatic issues. So if you're going into this book saying, hey, I want gay representation, like, take that with a grain of salt, because it is a very, very dark, potentially very offensive book. And I can understand why so many people might have a problem with it because of the material that it covers. Now, overall, I put this as number 4 on my list. Like I said, I greatly enjoyed it, and I am looking forward to reading the rest of the series. Once the second book comes out and I get around to reading it, then I will be able to better determine if I like this so much because it was in audiobook form, or if I just like this book because I like the book. Number 8 on the Goodreads list is Storm Cursed by Patricia Briggs, which is the 11th book in the Mercy Thompson, is it Thompson? Yes, Mercy Thompson series. So I didn't read this because I am not catching up in this long series just to read this one book. I have read previous books in this series, but it was years and years ago. I remember around book 6, which I have, so I have proof I've read it. I just didn't really care for the story anymore. It is about a woman who is a shifter, like a shapeshifter, who is also a mechanic, and it's just kind of like adventures in her world from her perspective. She's a very strong, I don't need no man type of character, and that's like great. But this is also, in my opinion, paranormal romance, not fantasy. This focuses far, far more on her relationships and her sex life, and there's just kind of like a background of a plot loosely based in fantasy because of the shifter thing that makes it where, like, gives you a story to follow. But really the purpose of these books is sex, and there's a lot of sex if I remember correctly. So personally, I think this is miscategorized, and I didn't read it, so I can't really give you much of an opinion on this. I'm leaving this as unranked. Next book at number 7 is Nora Roberts' Of Blood and Bone, and this is the second book in the Chosen series. Now, Nora Roberts is typically, for me, associated with romance novels, but this isn't a romance novel. There are romantic aspects in it, but they're really not part of the plot of the story. It's just couples get together. There's no sex scenes. This is a true fantasy series. Now, this series takes place in modern times, and a plague, a magical plague, has been released on the world, and it kills like 80% or more of the world's population. And some people it doesn't kill get like magical fairy-like abilities. So you have typical humans that are immune to the plague, and then you have humans that have turned into fairy creatures that are also immune to the plague. If you catch the plague and show symptoms of it, you don't survive. It just doesn't happen. So book 1 of this series, called Year 1, is basically the first year of the plague, and from its inception to the birth of the chosen one. And it's a good, like, it's a really interesting story in and of itself, but it also like builds the universe for you. Now, book 2 takes place 13 years after book 1, and the chosen is now a young adult, and it's basically hard middle book syndrome with this one. So it's introduction of the new characters that were children in the first book and have now grown up, and then it's kind of like world building where she knows she's the chosen one, she's training, and she's learning her magical abilities, and she's learning how to be a leader, and she's learning how to fight. And it's all character building, which is what typical middle books in a trilogy do. I enjoyed it, but I enjoy it as like the middle part of an overall series, not as a great standalone book by itself. I will be finishing out this series sometime this year because I am just thrilled with what's going on. I didn't expect to like this at all. I expected it to be some like casual romance that somehow got thrown in the fantasy series because there were witches or something in it. But I'm surprisingly really like this. So if you're skipping over the series because you don't think you're gonna like Nora Roberts, but you like books about the world ending and like society trying to go on after everything has vanished, then I really think you'll like this book. So I recommend picking it up. I rated this, what did I rate this? I rated this 6th on my list of books. Next in this list is number 6, which is The Winter of the Witch by Catherine Arden. Now, this is a very interesting placement for this book, because as far as star rating goes in the top 10 books, this has the highest star rating. It also had the most read, at least when I looked at this, when I started this series. This one was the most read of all of the books in the fantasy category. So why this is rated number 6 when it's widely popular and has the highest rating, I could not tell you. That doesn't make any sense at all to me statistically. I loved this book. I love the series. I love this book. This is one of like 3 whole books that I gave 5 stars to this entire year. So it is amazing. This follows Vasilisa Petrova, I think is her last name. Petrovna. Vasilisa Petrovna, who is a basic Russian, she's not a peasant girl, she's like not royalty, but nobility. She's Russian nobility, but in a poor sort of way. Like, Moscow at the time that this is taking place in is a small little gathering of huts, think medieval times is probably the best way to take this, except for it's in Russia, and it is a Russian fairy tale basically. So Russia at this time is coming into Christianity, and because the Russians are converting to Christianity, the old like nature gods that they worship of like hearth and stuff like that are being forgotten and then kind of dying off. So this is a battle of the nature gods and the new Christianity. And Vasilisa is she is a young girl in a time where young girls should be sewing and raising babies. But she wants to be out in the woods. She wants to save the creatures of fairyland that are being forgotten. She wants to live on her own, be her own woman. She doesn't want or need a man to take care of her. She can do this all by herself. But she's royalty or nobility, and that just doesn't happen. So the whole series follows her and her magical abilities, being able to see these creatures when most people can't, either because they're too human or because these creatures have been forgotten. This wraps up the whole series. It's a fantastic book. I can't really say a whole lot about it without giving things away, but the series ends well. I love the characters. I love the story of it. And it kind of fits all of my boxes for things that I like to read. It's fairy tale-ish. There's kind of like a sense of timelessness where the characters can step in and out of time and there's not really a clear path, and it's magical in a very fairy tale like magical thing. So highly recommend it. The books are short, so if you're looking for a finished short fantasy series, this is the way to go. My neighbors are being horrifically loud today for just long periods of time, so I apologize for any really bad background noise that you're gonna hear in this video. I gave Winter of the Witch my second place spot, which means there's a book coming up that I actually also gave 5 stars and liked better than this. Number 5 on the list is The Red Scrolls of Magic by Cassandra Clare. This is part of the Shadowhunter universe, and it's the first book in the Eldest Curses series. Now, if you read the Shadowhunter series, then you will recognize the characters in this because it's a spin-off series. It's from the perspective of Magnus and Alec Lightwood, and this is a story of them on vacation, basically traveling Europe, when somebody shows up and tells Magnus that there is a cult called the Red Hand that is causing havoc within the magical world, and the cult was created by Magnus thousands of years ago as a joke when he was being emo. Now, this is their adventure across Europe, trying to figure out who's in charge of the cult now, like what happened, why it's changed so much from when Magnus created it, different things like that. So this book is just not made for me. I'm fine with the Shadowhunter series. I remember loving it 10 years ago when I started reading it and I was much younger, but these are teenage books, and even this book is miscategorized. It should be in the young adult section. And this is a fantasy romance between 2 young gay men, which is great representation, but I am not young, male, or gay, so this just wasn't targeted towards me. As I was reading this series, I always identified with Clary, who was a young straight girl, a la me. So it made sense that I liked her. And while Alex is a cool character, very, very loyal, and Magnus is like fun and flamboyant, they just weren't characters targeted towards me, and I didn't particularly care about them in the main story. So reading a spin-off about them just wasn't for me. The story in and of itself is fine. It's great representation. It's a great love story, but it just really wasn't for me, and it's miscategorized. This should easily have been in the young adult section. And I actually have a really big problem with that, because all the other Shadowhunter books are considered young adult, which means people are putting this in fantasy, adult fantasy specifically, because they're so bigoted that a male-on-male romance is considered adult content, which is stupid as shit. And I'm kind of pissed that this is in the fantasy section instead of the young adult section where it belongs. Now, because I didn't particularly care for this, I rated this 9th out of my list of 11 books. Number 4 on Goodreads' list is a thick boy of a book called The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. And I hated this book. This is the one book on this entire list that I didn't like. So this takes place in a fantasy land that is very similar, divided east and west, to our societies. It's loosely based off of our societies, where the Western is like our English medieval type society, and then the Eastern is like an Eastern ancient type of society. So you get characters, you follow multiple characters throughout this book. You've got the queen, what is her name? Queen Sabran, and her line is historical in the fact that daughters, or every queen marries, has one daughter and one daughter only. They don't have any other children, and as long as their line continues, then the evil bad guy dragon in this book will stay locked away. That's the historical thing going on in this book for the past 1,000 years. Now, the queen right now does not want to get married and doesn't want to have children. So that's one of the major plot points of her line of the story. There is also basically a mage in a forbidden society of mages who is tasked with being one of the queen's lady of waiting. The queen does not know that she is a mage. She doesn't know anything about her history or anything like that. But like her entire point of existence is as a battle-like mage to protect the queen until she can give birth to an heir. Just in case that story is true. She questions, her and her society like question, like, is this really something that exists? But they want to make sure the queen is protected just in case that story is true. You also follow a girl named Tani or Tanny. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce her name. And she is a dragon rider in the Eastern Lands. And those are the three main characters. You follow some other characters, and it's basically a story of evil dragons that kind of want to destroy the world. And it's been 1,000 years since the last time you've seen these evil dragons, and they're starting to come back. And, you know, the characters have to go through and see how they can defeat this. So my problem with this book is it's boring. It's so boring. There's so much needless story about characters that I just could care less about in here. And once you actually get to the action parts, they're like glossed over. Like there are things needed, like even stories, like how to defeat the dragon, and then the items that you need to defeat this evil dragon, that have been lost for 1,000 years, and the characters just like happenstance stumble across them, and it is so much BS. It's like, give me a good story with a mystery and an adventurous plot to discover these things. Don't just make it where the good guys win the day because they happen to stumble across something that's been lost for 1,000 years. Like, that's a whole bunch of BS. And I really, 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 really didn't like the book because of that. So, as you can imagine, as the only book that I did not like on this list, this is number 11th out of 11. And yeah, I don't really have anything else to say for it. I know a lot of people like it, but I don't understand why people like it. If you like this book and you can explain to me why you liked it, please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear like a different perspective on what made this book good when I had so many problems with it. Next at number 3 on Goodreads list, we have George R.R. Martin's Fire and Blood, which I can understand that a lot of people are mad that he released this book, which is a history of the Targaryens, instead of finishing out his series that we've all been waiting years and years for. I'm gonna take this as a standalone type thing. Now, I read this earlier in the year. It had nothing to do with Goodreads. I just happened to read it earlier in the year. So I need it's the least recent in my memory. I still remember enjoying this book a lot. This is really just a straight up history of the Targaryens. It starts when the Targaryens first came to Westeros with their dragons, and it ends when the last dragon died. And there's going to be a second one that goes from when the dragons were killed to when the basic books started taking place, right? This one is probably hit or miss with readers because it reads like a history book, like a school history book about, like, the Habsburgs would be a really good way to say that. It's just like king, queen, this is their history, birth, death, important things that happen in their life. It reads like a straight up history book. I loved history classes in college, so I was fine reading this as a history book, but I understand that a lot of people would find that really, really boring. But if you like Game of Thrones, you enjoy history, fantasy history told as like legitimate history, then I think you'll really, really like this, especially if you're interested in like what happened to the dragons and how did this like group, or how did this family rule for so long in this world. I ranked this as 5th overall on my list. Number 2 on Goodreads' list is The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern, and this is one hell of a confusing book. So, beneath the earth is the Starless Sea, and in the harbors of the Starless Sea, there is a labyrinth of rooms and hallways that collects all of the stories of the world ever told, all of the stories of history. And at first, when you're thinking about that, you're like, oh, it's a giant library, but it's not stories like that. It's stories told like orally, or it's stories told in paintings, stories a little child makes up when playing with their dolls. There are books, but it's not only books. It's an eclectic mesh of everything in existence, whether it's a poem written on a napkin, or if it's a gigantic paper city made as a makeup game from a little girl in her dollhouse. And it's so magical and mystical, it just makes me really, really happy. So our main character in this book, Zachary Ezra Rollins, which people call him a bunch of different things, but I'm gonna call him Zachary. There's a bunch of things that happen. It's really, really hard to give you like a summary of what this story is because it's so confusing, and it's meant to be that way. It's meant to be a story within a story within a story that's a fairy tale, and it's very whimsical, and it's not linear at all, but it brings everything together at the end. The entire time I was reading 10,000 Doors of January, all I could think of was the Starless Sea did this premise better. I highly recommend this if you don't need a linear story. If you need a linear story, this is not for you. But this is the type of book that you read and then you want to read again afterwards to figure out what you missed the first time. And this just ticked every single box in what I'm currently enjoying and reading for me. And this is my number 1 book of the year. Also, obviously, the number 1 book on this list. So Goodreads winner, number 1 book, was The Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. And I have a feeling because of Leigh Bardugo's popularity in the young adult fiction world that a lot of people voted for this book because they hadn't read anything in the fantasy section. They were just teenagers who likes Leigh Bardugo and went, oh, I love that author, I'm gonna vote for this one. That being said, I don't think this is a bad book. I just don't think it deserves the number 1 spot. So the premise of this is that Alex Stern is part of a secret society that polices other secret societies at Yale. You've heard of like the Skull and Bones Society and stuff like that. Her society polices these other societies, and these societies perform death magic is basically the best way to put this, where they can do different types of magics, and it attracts the dead, but the dead can cause problems, so they need to be policed while the societies are doing their rituals. And Alex just has the magical ability to see dead people without having to take drugs that are typical for people in her role that are potentially very poisonous. One of those things where her ability just makes her wanted by the society more because it's less likely to harm her, because she doesn't have to take this drug. And she is kind of like an unfavorable former drug addict type person, not really great type of character, and not the typical Yale student. So me personally, like, I really enjoyed the mystery aspect of this. Like, she's solving a bunch of different mysteries throughout this, and I think it's pretty cool. I enjoyed it. I will definitely be reading the second book. What I didn't enjoy was her character. Like, I don't like her as a person. It's not somebody that I think I would be friends with, or that I can imagine myself in her shoes if she were a real person. And because it's character-driven story and only from her perspective, it's really, really hard to like the story if you don't like the character. And I think that's a lot of people's problem with this. Also, this isn't anything like any of Leigh Bardugo's other stories, and I think people who are typically fans of her are having issues with this story because it doesn't stand up to her other works, her young adult works. I haven't really read much of what she's written, but this is what I've kind of discovered by reading other people's reviews of this book. Personally, I put this as number 7. It's not great. It's not horrible. It's just kind of like right in the middle of meh land for me. But like I said, every book except for Priory on this list I liked. So number 7 isn't actually that bad of a ranking. That's everything. I'm going to throw up on the screen right here what Goodreads order was and then what my order was. Let me know if you agree or disagree with any of my rankings, why you hated a book that I like, or why you liked a book that I hated in the comments below. If there's something that you feel like I'm missing, I would love to hear what I missed in this story. I will be reading more of the 2019 Goodreads choice in different categories. That will be a completely separate video because this one is already long. Thank you so much for watching this video, and we'll see you next time.